The chipped Ford pickup rattled along the dirt track, each bump a familiar percussion against Caleb's ribs. August in North Dakota was a study in browns and golds, the wheat fields already surrendering to the coming harvest. Dust devils danced on the horizon, mimicking the unsettled feeling in his gut. The Olson farm. Routine inspection. That is what he kept telling himself. He'd been doing these inspections for the bank for almost 3 years now. A quiet, solitary existence, after everything. It wasn't glamorous work. Ensuring collateral for loans was sound, but it kept him fed, kept him moving, and most importantly, didn't require him to look anyone in the eye for too long. The Olson place wasn't much to look at. A weathered farmhouse, the color of faded bone, sat amidst a sprawling potato field. A barn, equally dilapidated, leaned like a tired man against the prairie wind. It wasn't the biggest farm in Ramsey County, but Old Man Olson had always been a reliable borrower. Caleb killed the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the drone of insects and the distant call of a hawk. He stretched, his knuckles cracking, and climbed out of the truck. The air was dry, carrying the scent of turned earth and something else. Something sickly sweet, almost cloying. He couldn't place it. Old Man Olson was waiting on the porch, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick. His face, already a roadmap of wrinkles, was etched with a fresh layer of worry. He didn't offer a wave, just a curt nod. "You're late," Olson rasped, his voice roughened by years of sun and silence. "Traffic," Caleb lied, glancing at the empty road. It was a habit, offering explanations, even when none were needed, just getting the yearly check done. "How is everything been?" The old man's gaze drifted to the field. "Been better." Caleb followed his gaze. The potato plants were wrong. Healthy. Potato plants were a vibrant green, leaves thick and full. These were mottled, stained with patches of purple and brown, the leaves curling inward, as if recoiling from the sun. It looked like a disease, but not one he recognized. He'd spent enough time on farms to know a little about blight, about potato beetles, about the constant struggle against rot. This wasn't any of those. He walked into the field, the dry stalks crunching under his boots. The closer he got, the stronger that sickly sweet smell became. It was unsettling, unnatural. He knelt, examining a particularly afflicted plant. The discoloration wasn't random. It formed patterns, strange, almost geometric shapes on the leaves. "What is it?" Caleb asked, his voice flat. Olson shuffled closer, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. "Don't know. Just appeared. Started about a week ago. Spreading fast. Have you called an agricultural specialist? Waste of money. They'll tell me it is nothing, or tell me to spray something that'll cost more than the crop's worth." Olson spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the dusty ground. "I've seen things, boy. Things they don't teach you in college. This ain't natural." Caleb didn't press him. He'd learned long ago that farmers held onto their superstitions like lifelines. He pulled out his notepad, making a cursory examination, jotting down observations he didn't quite believe. How much of the field is affected? Hard to say. Keeps changing. Seems like overnight it jumps to a new section. Olson's hand trembled as he pointed towards the far side of the field. Started small, just a patch over there now. He trailed off, shaking his head. Caleb walked further into the field, methodically checking plants, section by section. The patterns on the leaves became more pronounced, more deliberate. It wasn't just random discoloration. It resembled symbols, crude, almost childlike, but recognizable. He took a photo with his phone, zooming in on one leaf. A spiral, another, a broken circle, a third, something that looked disturbingly like an eye. He frowned, feeling a prickle of unease. He'd seen markings like that before. Not on potato plants. in a very different context. He pushed the thought away. He was letting his imagination run wild. "You seem quiet," Olsen said, watching him from the edge of the field. "Not what I expected from a bankman." "Just assessing the situation," Caleb replied, carefully avoiding eye contact. "Has anything else been unusual?" Olsen hesitated, then glanced nervously at the farmhouse. "A few things. Livestock acting strange. My dog, Buster, won't go near the field. Just whines and hides under the porch. Strange how. Restless, won't settle, barks at nothing, and he has been having nightmares. Waking up shaking, howling. Animals can sense things we can't," Caleb offered, knowing it sounded hollow even to his own ears. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the buzz of insects and the rustle of the diseased plants. The smell was growing stronger, making Caleb's stomach churn. As they walked back towards the porch, a pickup truck rumbled down the dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust. It slowed as it approached, the driver leaning out the window. It was Dale Hansen, a local farmer known for his brusque manner and his long memory. "Caleb," Hansen called out, his voice gravelly. "Fancy seeing you here. Thought you'd be busy counting other people's money." Caleb braced himself. He knew Hansen hadn't forgotten, the town hadn't forgotten. "Just doing my job, Dale," Caleb said, keeping his tone neutral. Hansen smirked, his eyes narrowed. "Right, doing your job. You always were good at finding things. Lost cattle, mostly. Though some folks said you were more interested in making them lost." The jab was blatant, a reference to the accusations that had forced Caleb to leave his life, severed his previous life Sivender behind. He'd been accused of rustling, of stealing cattle and selling them for profit. The charges had never stuck, but the suspicion had lingered, poisoning his reputation. "That was a long time ago, Dale," Caleb said, his voice tight. "Some things you don't forget, Caleb. Some things stick to you like dirt." Hansen's gaze flickered to Old Man Olsen, then back to Caleb. "Olsen here is having a bad time of it. This blight, it is bad. But I heard tell, it is affecting other farms too. Little pockets of it, all over the county." "Other farms?" Caleb asked, his curiosity piqued. "That is what I hear. Folks are keeping quiet, though. Don't want to be seen as weak or cursed." Hansen let the last word hang in the air, then grinned again. "Just keep your eyes open, Caleb. You never know what you'll find when you're digging around in other people's business." He threw the truck into gear and sped off, leaving a trail of dust and unspoken accusations in his wake. Caleb forced himself to breathe slowly, fighting back the familiar surge of anger. Hansen was a thorn in his side, a constant reminder of the past he was trying to escape. He turned back to Olsen, who was watching him with a worried expression. "Don't mind Dale," Caleb said, forcing a smile. "He just likes to stir things up." "He is right about one thing," Olsen said, his voice low. "It is not just my field. Old man Hemmings, over by the river, he called me this morning. Said he has got the same thing happening to his corn. And Martha Peterson said her tomatoes are all twisted and black." Caleb felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. If the blight was spreading, affecting different crops on different farms, it wasn't a random occurrence. It wasn't a natural disease. He pulled out his phone again, scrolling through the photos he'd taken of the diseased potato leaves. He zoomed in on the image of the spiral, then rotated the phone, flipping the image upside down. And then he saw it, the spiral, the broken circle, the eye. They weren't random. They weren't childlike scribbles. They were arranged in a specific order, mirroring a pattern, a symbol. He recognized it vaguely, a half-remembered image from a book he'd once seen, a long time ago. A book about occult practices. He couldn't recall the details, but he remembered the symbol. It was a warding symbol. But warding against what? He looked up, scanning the field, his eyes searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. And then he noticed it. In the center of the field, hidden amongst the diseased plants, was a small, meticulously constructed circle of stones. Each stone was carefully placed, forming a perfect ring. And within the ring, nestled in the dirt, was a single black feather. He started towards it, an icy dread creeping up his spine. This wasn't a blight. It was something else entirely. Something deliberate. Something placed. The black feather felt unnaturally light in Caleb's hand, almost brittle. He turned it over, examining its glossy surface. It wasn't from any bird he recognized, too long, too slender, the color, an absolute, absorbing black. He carefully placed it in an evidence bag, a habit from a life he'd tried to bury. Old habits he'd learned, died hard. He spent the rest of the day mapping the affected farms. Using a county map spread across the hood of his truck, he marked each location with a pin. Old Man Hemming's cornfield, Martha Peterson's tomato patch, 2 other farms reporting similar issues. Sudi, all within a 20-mile radius. As he connected the pins with a red marker, a pattern began to emerge. It wasn't random. The farms weren't scattered haphazardly. They formed a rough pentagon. The points aligned with an almost unsettling precision. It echoed the patterns on the potato leaves, the spiral, the broken circle. It was a deliberate design, imposed on the landscape. Caleb felt a shiver crawl down his spine. This was beyond a simple agricultural disaster. This felt calculated. He started making calls, trying to talk to the other affected farmers. It wasn't easy. Most were wary, suspicious of outsiders, especially one asking too many questions. Old Man Hemmings grumbled about government conspiracies and muttered about things best left undisturbed. Martha Peterson, normally a chatty woman, clammed up as soon as he mentioned the symbols on the leaves. "Just a bad season, young man," she'd said, her voice tight. "Happens sometimes. Best not to poke around where you ain't wanted." The resistance reinforced Caleb's growing unease. It wasn't just fear of the blight driving their reluctance. It was fear of something else, something they weren't willing to articulate. He returned to the Olsen farm late in the afternoon, hoping to glean more information. Olsen was sitting on the porch, staring out at the ravaged field, with a haunted look in his eyes. "Found anything?" Olsen asked without turning. "A pattern," Caleb said. "The farms are laid out in a specific arrangement." Olsen finally turned, his gaze locking with Caleb's. "You think someone's doing this?" "I don't know what to think, but it is not random, that is for sure." He paused, then asked, "What kind of fertilizer did you use this year?" Olsen frowned. "The usual. That tri-state blend. Been using it for years." "Are you certain?" "Of course, I'm certain. What are you getting at?" "Just checking. I noticed a couple of the other farms are using a new brand this year. BloomRite. Heard good things about it. Supposed to increase yields." Olsen waved his hand dismissively. "BloomRite, too expensive, and too new, fangled. I stick with what I know." Caleb thanked Olsen and headed towards the co-op in Ramsey. He spent an hour going through their records, cross-referencing fertilizer purchases with a list of affected farms. He confirmed his suspicions. Every single farm experiencing the blight had purchased BloomRite fertilizer within the last 3 months. He asked the co-op manager, a wiry man named Earl, about BloomRite. "New company," Earl said, wiping his hands on his overalls. "Out of Minnesota. Sales rep was real slick, promised the moon. Lots of farmers tried it this year. Seems like it ain't working out so well for some of 'em." "Do you know anything about the company?" Caleb asked. Earl shook his head. "Not much. They're kinda secretive. Don't give out much information. Just focusing on sales, from what I hear." Caleb felt a knot tightening in his stomach. The fertilizer. It was the common denominator. the link between the farms. But why? Who would deliberately poison the land? And why arrange it in such a precise, disturbing pattern? The question triggered a memory, a fragment of his past he'd tried desperately to suppress. A rain-soaked night, the smell of wet earth and diesel fuel, a herd of cattle penned and ready for transport. He was barely 20, then desperate for money, caught in a cycle of bad decisions. He and his brother Jesse had been rustling cattle, selling them to shady buyers across the state line. It hadn't been about greed, not entirely. Their family farm was failing, swallowed by debt. Jesse had convinced him it was a temporary measure, a way to save their home, but it had quickly spiraled out of control, leading to recklessness and eventually to Jesse's arrest. Caleb had narrowly escaped, disappearing before the sheriff could find him. He'd changed his name, reinvented himself, and spent years running from the ghosts of his past. He'd vowed never to get involved in anything shady again, never to take risks, never to draw attention to himself. But this felt different. This wasn't about money. This was about something far more sinister, and he couldn't ignore it. He spent the evening researching BloomRite online, finding little information. The company's website was sparse, offering only basic details and glowing testimonials. There was no information about the founders, the management team, or the source of their fertilizer. It was a ghost company operating in the shadows. He decided to grab a bite to eat at the Lucky Spoon Diner, a local institution known for its bottomless coffee and its gossip, hungry clientele. He needed to clear his head, and a greasy burger might help. He slid into a booth, signaling to Marlene, the waitress. As she took his order, he scanned the diner, his gaze lingering on the faces of the other patrons. Farmers, ranchers, truck drivers, locals, nursing their coffees, ordinary people, living ordinary lives. But then his eyes landed on a man sitting in a booth across the room. He was dressed in a dark suit, looking out of place amongst the flannel shirts and work boots. He was meticulously stirring his coffee, not looking at anyone, but somehow aware. Caleb recognized him. Robert Sterling, the regional manager for BloomRite. He'd seen his picture on the company's website. He'd dismissed it at the time, but now, it felt like a deliberate sign. Sterling raised his head slowly, his eyes meeting Caleb's. He didn't smile. He didn't look surprised. He just held Caleb's gaze for a long, unnerving moment, then slowly lowered his eyes back to his coffee. Caleb felt a prickle of fear. He was being watched. He was being assessed. He'd stumbled onto something dangerous, and someone was taking notice. Marlene brought his burger, snapping him out of his reverie. He forced himself to eat, to appear casual, to blend in. But his appetite was gone. He knew with a chilling certainty that his quiet life was over. He finished his coffee, paid his bill, and walked out of the diner, feeling Sterling's eyes burning into his back. He glanced back, but Sterling was gone. The fields surrounding Ramsey County lay bathed in the fading light, stretching out like a dark, ominous canvas. The pattern was spreading, and someone was watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. The Ford's suspension groaned in protest as Caleb navigated the washboard, dirt road leading away from the Lucky Spoon. He needed information, concrete information, beyond the vague unease clinging to him like the prairie dust. He headed towards the Ramsey County courthouse, hoping to dig up something solid on BloomRite fertilizer. The county clerk, a woman named Doris, who remembered everyone and everything, raised a skeptical eyebrow as he requested business records for the company. BloomRite. They're a new one, started up just last year. Big spenders, though. Lots of contracts with the farmers around here. Caleb requested the articles of incorporation, the ownership filings, anything that might reveal who was behind the company. What he found was odd. The registered agent was a shell corporation based in Delaware, a common enough practice, but the listed owners were a series of other shell corporations. Layered like an onion, it was deliberately obfuscated, designed to hide the true beneficiaries. That is unusual, Doris commented, peering over her glasses. Most companies, even the small ones, have real people attached to them. This just looks like a lot of legal maneuvering to keep things hidden. Caleb agreed. It felt like a carefully constructed facade. He dug deeper, searching for any connection to known agricultural businesses, any red flags. He found nothing. BloomRite had seemingly sprung up from nowhere, secured a massive influx of capital, and quickly cornered a significant portion of the local fertilizer market. He spent the rest of the morning tracing the company's financial trail, following the money as far as he could. It led to a series of offshore accounts, each one a dead end. It was a professional operation, meticulously planned and executed. Someone didn't want to be found. Just as he was about to give up, Doris called him over. Found something. Look at this. She pointed to a small article in the county archives. A brief mention of a land purchase a year ago. BloomRite had bought a large tract of farmland just outside of town, paying well above market value. The previous owner, a man named Arthur Harding. The name clicked into place. Robert Harding, BloomRite's regional manager, the man from the diner. Caleb felt a surge of adrenaline. It was a connection, a real one. He needed to talk to Harding. He found Harding at the BloomRite distribution center on the outskirts of Ramsey. The facility was surprisingly large, bustling with activity. Trucks loading and unloading, workers mixing and bagging fertilizer. Harding was overseeing the operation, his face impassive, his eyes sharp and calculating. Caleb approached him, flashing a disarming smile. Mr. Harding, I'm Caleb Hayes. I was hoping to ask you a few questions about BloomRite. Harding didn't return the smile. He studied Caleb for a long moment, his gaze assessing, unsettling. Mr. Hayes, I was wondering when you might show up. Just doing some research, Caleb said, keeping his voice light. I'm with the bank. We like to stay informed about our borrowers, and I hear BloomRite is doing very well. We are, Harding said, his voice smooth as oil, providing local farmers with a superior product, helping them maximize their yields. I've also heard reports of some issues. Caleb pressed. Some farms experiencing problems with their crops after using BloomRite. Harding's expression hardened. Isolated incidents, minor setbacks. Every fertilizer has occasional issues. We stand behind our product. But several farms, all using BloomRite, all experiencing similar symptoms. Caleb trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Harding stepped closer, invading Caleb's personal space. Look, Mr. Hayes, I understand you're just doing your job, but I suggest you focus on your banking and leave the agriculture to those who understand it. Some things are best left undisturbed. He paused, his eyes locking with Caleb's. We're making a lot of people a lot of money with BloomRite, and we don't appreciate anyone stirring up trouble. The threat was thinly veiled, but unmistakable. Caleb met Harding's gaze without flinching. I'm just asking questions, Mr. Harding, that is all. Then I suggest you ask them somewhere else. Harding turned and walked away, leaving Caleb standing amidst the swirling dust and the acrid smell of fertilizer. Caleb knew he'd hit a nerve. Harding was hiding something, and he wasn't afraid to use intimidation to keep it hidden. He needed to tread carefully. He decided to revisit the Olson farm. He'd remembered Olson mentioning an old barn, filled with discarded equipment and forgotten relics. Maybe there was something there, some clue. The barn was exactly as Olson had described, footy in a crumbling structure, choked with cobwebs and dust. Old tractors sat rusting in the corners, surrounded by piles of broken tools and discarded machinery. The air was thick with the smell of decay. After an hour of searching, he found it. Hidden behind a stack of rotting hay bales was a small wooden chest. It was locked, but a few well-placed strikes with a rusted wrench convinced it to yield. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed papers and brittle photographs, was a notebook, bound in faded leather, its pages filled with meticulous handwritten notes, diagrams, and chemical formulas. The notebook belonged to a Dr. Elias Thorne. The date on the cover, 1958. Caleb began to scan the contents, his heart pounding in his chest. The notebook detailed a series of agricultural experiments, research into soil composition, plant genetics, and the effects of various chemical compounds on crop growth. Thorne had been obsessed with finding a way to increase yields, to create a super fertilizer that would revolutionize agriculture. The formulas were complex, filled with obscure chemical names and intricate calculations. But as Caleb continued to read, he noticed a pattern. Several of the compounds listed bore a striking resemblance to the ingredients listed on the BloomRite fertilizer packaging. He flipped through the pages, his breath catching in his throat. He stopped on a page filled with complex calculations, a formula for a compound identified as Compound X. The formula was eerily similar, almost identical, to one of the key components in BloomRite's proprietary blend, but there was a warning alongside the formula, scrawled in Thorne's frantic handwriting. Unstable, potential for unforeseen consequences. Discontinue testing. Caleb stared at the page, his mind reeling. BloomRite wasn't just using Thorne's research, they were ignoring his warnings. They were deliberately utilizing a dangerous, unstable compound. He carefully closed the notebook, his hands trembling. He had found the link, but he also knew, with a growing sense of dread, that he had stumbled into something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. He could feel eyes on him, watching from the shadows. Harding's words echoed in his mind. Some things are best left undisturbed. The notebook offered more than just formulas. Embedded within Dr. Thorne's meticulously detailed notes were coordinates, a location etched onto a faded map tucked between the final pages. A remote area in the hills, bordering Ramsey County, marked simply as Site Alpha. Caleb didn't hesitate. He knew, with grim certainty, that Site Alpha held the answers he was seeking. He packed a bag with essentials: a flashlight, a first aid kit, and the revolver he'd kept hidden under the seat of his truck, a relic from his past he'd hoped never to use again. The drive was arduous, the paved road giving way to a rutted dirt track that wound through dense forest. The hills loomed around him, casting long, skeletal shadows. He reached the coordinates late in the afternoon, finding a crumbling, overgrown access road leading to a cluster of dilapidated buildings. Site Alpha was a ghost town, a former research facility, abandoned and decaying, swallowed by the relentless advance of nature. Broken windows stared out like empty sockets, the walls covered in moss and graffiti. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying metal. He moved cautiously, his senses on high alert. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the chirping of crickets. He entered the main building, a cavernous structure that once housed a laboratory. The lab was a chaotic mess. Equipment lay scattered across the floor, rusted and broken. Shelves were overturned, their contents spilled and broken. Papers were strewn everywhere, their ink faded and illegible. But amidst the wreckage he found evidence of recent activity: empty food containers, cigarette butts, and a half-empty bottle of water. Someone had been here recently. He began to piece together the puzzle, searching for clues. He found a logbook, its pages filled with cryptic entries detailing experiments with genetically modified organisms and advanced chemical compounds. The research, it became increasingly clear, wasn't focused on improving crop yields. It was focused on creating something else entirely. He discovered a hidden room behind a false wall, a makeshift laboratory equipped with sophisticated equipment. He found vials of concentrated chemicals, labeled with the same compounds listed in Dr. Thorne's notebook. He found research papers outlining the development of a bioagent, disguised as fertilizer designed to weaken and destroy crops. It wasn't a fertilizer. It was a weapon. The realization hit him like a physical blow. BloomRite wasn't trying to feed the world. They were trying to poison it. As he was examining a particularly troubling document detailing the agent's dispersal method, he heard a noise behind him. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate. He turned and found himself facing Robert Harding, flanked by 4 armed men. Harding's expression was cold and devoid of emotion. "Looks like you've been a busy boy, Mr. Hayes," Harding said, his voice devoid of warmth. "I warned you to stay out of this." "You're poisoning the land," Caleb said, his voice steady, despite the fear gripping his gut, creating a blight. "Why?" Harding chuckled, a harsh, rasping sound. "Sentimentality doesn't pay the bills, Mr. Hayes. This isn't about poisoning the land, it is about controlling it." Controlling it, exactly. The agricultural market is too fragmented, too inefficient, too much land in the hands of small farmers who can't compete. We're streamlining the process, removing the weak links, creating opportunities for consolidation. Harding gestured to his men. "Once the crops fail, the farms will go bankrupt. The land will become available, and we'll be there to buy it up at rock-bottom prices." "You're ruining people's lives," Caleb said, his fists clenching. "Collateral damage," Harding said dismissively. "Necessary for progress. You wouldn't understand. You're a relic of a bygone era, clinging to a romanticized view of rural life." "This isn't progress," Caleb retorted. "It is exploitation. It is business, Mr. Hayes, and you've become a liability." Harding nodded to his men. "Take him." The men advanced, their weapons raised. Caleb knew he was outnumbered, outgunned, but he wasn't going down without a fight. He'd faced worse in his past. He dropped to the floor, rolling beneath a table, grabbing a broken piece of glass for a makeshift weapon. One of the men opened fire, shattering the glass above his head. Caleb scrambled to his feet, dodging another barrage of bullets, and lunged at the nearest gunman, slashing at his face with the glass shard. A chaotic struggle erupted. Caleb fought with a desperate ferocity fueled by adrenaline and righteous anger. He disarmed one of the men, using his weapon to fend off the others. He was a whirlwind of motion, a ghost from his past reawakened. But the odds were stacked against him. He was bruised, battered, and bleeding. He managed to knock down 2 of the men, but the remaining 2 kept pressing the attack. He broke free from the melee, dashing through the crumbling lab, dodging overturned equipment and collapsing debris. He burst out of the building, sprinting into the forest, the sound of gunfire echoing behind him. He navigated the dense undergrowth, weaving through trees and scrambling over fallen logs. He could hear his pursuers crashing through the brush, closing in on him. He reached a steep ravine, a natural barrier that might slow them down. He leaped across the chasm, landing heavily on the other side, twisting his ankle in the process. Ignoring the pain, he continued to run, pushing himself to the limit. He stumbled upon a hidden cave, a narrow opening concealed behind a waterfall. He squeezed inside, collapsing against the damp rock wall, gasping for air. He thought he'd lost them, but he was wrong. He heard the sound of footsteps approaching the cave entrance. Harding emerged from the forest, his face grim, his eyes burning with fury. "Nowhere left to run, Mr. Hayes," Harding said, his voice dripping with menace. "You know too much, and now you're going to pay the price." He paused, a chilling smile spreading across his face. "You think you're dismantling the agricultural market?" Caleb asked, struggling to catch his breath. "You're playing with forces you don't understand. This isn't about land. It is about food security, about control, about destabilizing the entire system." Harding's smile vanished. "You're closer than you think, Mr. Hayes. This isn't just about consolidation. It is about creating dependence. Control the food supply, and you control the population. It has been a plan decades in the making. He gestured to the men who had joined him at the cave entrance. And you, Mr. Hayes, have become a threat to that plan. The cave was cramped, the air thick with the smell of mildew and damp earth. Harding's men advanced slowly, their weapons trained on Caleb. He was cornered, injured, and outnumbered, but he wasn't beaten. Not yet. Years spent surviving outside the law had honed his instincts, sharpened his reflexes. He remembered the lessons learned in his youth, the unforgiving rules of a life lived on the fringes. He wasn't the man he'd been trying to be for the past 3 years. He was reverting. He waited for the opportune moment, for the slightest lapse in their vigilance. When one of the men shifted his weight, momentarily lowering his guard, Caleb struck. A swift kick to the groin, a disarm, and the man crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. The second man reacted quickly, raising his weapon. Caleb ducked under the barrel, driving his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him stumbling backward. He grabbed the man's gun, twisting it free, and used it to knock him unconscious. Harding, his face contorted with rage, drew his own weapon. He was a practiced shooter, his movements precise and deliberate. Caleb knew he couldn't afford to hesitate. He fired, the shot echoing through the cave, narrowly missing Harding's head. Harding returned fire, the bullet ricocheting off the cave wall, showering Caleb with sparks. He dove for cover behind a large rock, returning fire, forcing Harding to take cover. The exchange was brief, but intense. Relying on his years of experience, used the terrain to his advantage, moving quickly and unpredictably. He managed to wound Harding in the arm, forcing him to drop his weapon. The remaining men, realizing their leader was losing, hesitated. Caleb seized the opportunity, disarming them with a flurry of swift, calculated movements. Within minutes, the cave was silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of the unconscious men. He quickly secured Harding, binding his hands with a length of rope he found in the cave. He needed to get the evidence out to alert the authorities. But he knew he couldn't trust the local police. Harding had likely compromised them. He remembered a contact from his past, a former colleague at the USDA, Sarah Jenkins. He'd worked with her years ago before he disappeared. She was honest, dedicated, and fiercely independent. He'd kept her number, squirreled away in a hidden compartment in his truck. He returned to the lab, gathering as much evidence as he could carry 14 vials of the tainted fertilizer, research papers, logbooks, the incriminating formula. He downloaded the data from the facility's computers onto a portable hard drive, carefully encrypting the files. He knew he was running out of time. Harding's men likely had backup, and they wouldn't hesitate to retaliate. He needed to get the evidence to Sarah, and fast. He found a shortwave radio in the lab, miraculously still functional. He used it to send a coded message to Sarah, alerting her to the situation and providing her with the coordinates of Site Alpha. As he was finishing the transmission, he heard a noise outside the lab. Harding, having recovered from his wound, was attempting to destroy the evidence. He was pouring gasoline on the research papers, preparing to set them ablaze. Caleb burst out of the lab, tackling Harding to the ground. They struggled, a desperate fight for survival. Caleb managed to wrest the can of gasoline from Harding's grasp, dousing him with the flammable liquid. "Don't even think about it," Caleb growled, pointing Harding's own discarded pistol at him. Harding, defeated and humiliated, glared at Caleb with venomous hatred. "You haven't won, Hayes. This is bigger than you can imagine." Caleb ignored him, securing Harding with the remaining rope. He located a fire extinguisher and quickly doused the flames, saving the remaining evidence. He knew he couldn't stay. His presence at the scene would only complicate matters. He needed to disappear to ensure the evidence reached Sarah safely. He slipped away from Site Alpha, leaving Harding and his men for the authorities. He drove for hours, navigating back roads and dirt tracks. He needed to establish a distance, to make it harder for them to track him. He eventually reached a prearranged rendezvous point, a remote rest stop on the interstate. He left the hard drive containing the encrypted data with a trucker he vaguely knew, a man named Big Joe, with instructions to deliver it to Sarah Jenkins. He continued driving, losing himself in the anonymity of the open road. He knew he was a fugitive again, hunted by forces he didn't fully understand. 2 days later, the news broke. Federal agents raided Site Alpha, arresting Harding and his cohorts. The contaminated fertilizer was recalled, and an investigation was launched into the conspiracy. The story dominated the headlines, exposing the plot to destabilize the agricultural market and consolidate land ownership. Caleb watched the news unfold from a cheap motel room in Montana, feeling a sense of relief mixed with dread. He had stopped them. But he knew he wasn't safe. His past had a way of catching up with him. He was reading a local paper when the knock came. 2 federal agents stood at the door, their faces grim. "Caleb Hayes," one of them asked. Caleb nodded slowly. "We need you to come with us." He didn't resist. He knew this was coming. At the federal building in Billings, he was questioned relentlessly. The agents were polite but firm, probing his past, scrutinizing his actions. "We understand you were involved in uncovering the BloomRite conspiracy," one of the agents, a woman named Agent Reynolds, said. "We appreciate your assistance, but we also have some questions about your background." Caleb braced himself. He knew they'd eventually uncover his true identity, his history as a rustler. He had anticipated it. But it didn't make it any easier. Agent Reynolds slid a file across the table. It contained newspaper clippings, arrest warrants, and photographs. His old life, resurrected. "Caleb Hayes," she read, her voice devoid of emotion. "Also known as Jesse Harding, wanted for cattle rustling, grand theft, and conspiracy." Caleb remained silent, his gaze fixed on the file. His carefully constructed facade had crumbled. His past had finally caught up to him. "It seems you have quite a history, Mr. Hayes," Agent Reynolds said, raising an eyebrow. "A history you conveniently failed to mention." Caleb knew he had a long road ahead of him. Exposing the BloomRite conspiracy had saved countless farms, but it had also exposed his own dark secrets. He had stepped out of the shadows. But now he was facing a reckoning. He traded one set of problems for another, and he wasn't sure which was worse. The metallic clang of the jail cell door echoed the hollowness in Caleb's chest. The past wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a cage. Agent Reynolds had been true to her word. The outstanding warrants from Ramsey County, dormant for years, had been reactivated. Cattle rustling, grand theft, conspiracy, Findi. The charges were a stark reminder of the life he'd tried so desperately to escape. He didn't fight it. Resistance was futile. Besides, he knew cooperation was his only hope. He spent the next several days detailing everything he knew about BloomRite, about Harding, about the carefully orchestrated plot to destabilize the agricultural market. He laid out the evidence, the connections, the pattern he discovered, leaving nothing out. The FBI meticulously corroborated his story. Sarah Jenkins, true to her word, had delivered the encrypted data to the authorities, confirming everything Caleb had claimed. The investigation widened, uncovering layers of corruption and illicit financial transactions. Robert Harding and his associates were formally indicted on multiple charges, including conspiracy, fraud, and the endangerment of public health. The media frenzy was relentless. BloomRite was exposed as a sham, a weapon masquerading as a fertilizer. The fallout was immense, sending shockwaves through the agricultural community. Caleb's testimony proved crucial in securing convictions. He relived the traumatic events, recounting his confrontation with Harding, the discovery of the lab, the desperate attempt to expose the truth. It wasn't easy, dredging up the ghosts of his past, but he knew it was necessary. His lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Elena Vargas, argued tirelessly for a reduced sentence. She presented a compelling case, emphasizing Caleb's cooperation, his willingness to come forward despite the risk to himself, and his remorse for his past actions. "My client made mistakes," Ms. Vargas told the judge during the sentencing hearing. "Serious mistakes. But he has demonstrably atoned for them. He risked his life to expose a dangerous conspiracy, saving countless farms and protecting the nation's food supply. I urge the court to recognize his heroism and grant him leniency." The judge, a stern-faced man named Judge Thompson, weighed the evidence carefully. He acknowledged Caleb's cooperation and the significance of his testimony, but he couldn't ignore his past. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Thompson said, his voice resonating through the courtroom, "you have committed serious crimes. You have violated the trust of this community, and you have caused considerable harm to innocent people. However, in light of your cooperation and the extraordinary circumstances of this case, I am prepared to offer you a degree of mercy." He sentenced Caleb to 3 years in federal prison, a significantly reduced sentence compared to the decades he could have faced. But the damage was done. His reputation was tarnished, his past irrevocably linked to his present. The prison was a brutal, unforgiving place. He kept to himself, avoiding trouble, enduring the daily grind of confinement. He used his time to reflect, to confront his demons, to try to make sense of the choices he'd made. He thought about Jesse, his brother, the man who had dragged him into the world of crime. Jesse was still incarcerated, serving a lengthy sentence for his role in the rustling operation. He doubted it. After serving 2 years, he was granted parole. He walked out of the prison gates a changed man, his face etched with the hardships he'd endured. He carried the weight of his past, the burden of his choices, and the knowledge that he would forever be branded a criminal. He found a small, dilapidated cabin in the mountains of Montana, far away from the towns and the people he'd known. He took a job as a ranch hand, working long hours in the harsh elements, seeking solace in the solitude of the wilderness. He tried to rebuild his life, to forget the past. But it wasn't easy. The whispers followed him, the stares lingered, the judgment never ceased. He was an outsider, a pariah, forever marked by his past mistakes. One evening, as he was sitting on the porch of his cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of orange and gold, he found a small, unmarked envelope taped to his door. He hesitated for a moment, a sense of unease washing over him. He cautiously opened the envelope and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. On it was a single sentence, written in a blocky, unfamiliar handwriting. BloomRite was just the beginning. Look closer at Harvest Corp. His blood ran cold. Harvest Corp, a massive agricultural conglomerate with interests in everything from seed production to food processing. He'd heard whispers about them during the BloomRite investigation, vague rumors about their ruthless business practices and their connections to powerful figures. He dismissed them as mere speculation. But now he wasn't so sure. The anonymous message sent a shiver down his spine. BloomRite hadn't been a standalone operation. It had been part of something bigger, something far more sinister. And he had a feeling that he was about to be drawn back into the darkness, whether he wanted to or not. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that his reckoning wasn't over. It had just begun. The chipped Formica countertop felt cool beneath Caleb's forearms as he stared out the window of the Harmony Creek Agricultural Department office. It wasn't glamorous work than soil sample analysis, pest control consultations, issuing permits soon, but it was honest, and it was a long way from rustling cattle or uncovering conspiracies. He'd taken the job 6 months after his release, consciously choosing a life of quiet anonymity. He'd shed the name, Hayes, and legally reverted to his birth name, Daniel Carter, a symbolic act of shedding the past. The small town of Harmony Creek, nestled deep in the Montana foothills, was the perfect place to disappear. Not everyone welcomed him with open arms. The whispers followed him, the sidelong glances, the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered a room. Many still remembered the headlines, the accusations, the shame he'd brought to the county. Old man Hemmings, whose farm he'd indirectly helped save during the BloomRite scandal, refused to meet his eye. Government man, he'd muttered once, spitting tobacco juice onto the ground. Birds of a feather, but there were exceptions. Martha Peterson, the tomato farmer, surprised him with a plate of fresh-baked cookies and a quiet apology. "I misjudged you, Daniel," she'd said, her voice gentle. "Sometimes folks need a second chance." A gruff but fair man had extended a cautious hand of friendship. "I hear you did good work back then, uncovering that fertilizer mess," he told Caleb during one of their infrequent encounters. "Doesn't excuse what you did before, but it shows you got some backbone." Caleb found solace in the routine of his job, in the tangible connection to the land. He enjoyed working with the farmers, offering advice, helping them diagnose problems, contributing to the community. It wasn't fulfillment, exactly, but it was a semblance of peace. But the past lingered, a shadow in the corners of his mind. He found himself constantly questioning things, scrutinizing motives, searching for hidden agendas. He'd learned a hard lesson, Tuesday, that institutions weren't always what they seemed, that power could corrupt, and that even the most well-intentioned organizations could be manipulated. He still thought about BloomRite, about Harding, about the vast network of corruption he'd uncovered, providing detailed accounts of the conspiracy, but the wheels of justice moved slowly. The full extent of the damage, the reach of the organization, remained shrouded in mystery. He'd tried to let it go, to focus on his own life. But the anonymous message he'd received upon his release haunted him. Look closer at Harverscorp. He'd dismissed it as the ramblings of a paranoid conspiracy theorist, but the seed of doubt had been planted. He'd spent the last few months discreetly researching Harverscorp, poring over financial reports, regulatory filings, and news articles. The company was a behemoth, a multinational corporation with tentacles reaching into nearly every aspect of the agricultural industry. It controlled vast tracts of farmland, dominated the seed market, and wielded considerable political influence. He hadn't found anything concrete, no smoking gun, but there were unsettling patterns, unexplained financial transactions, questionable lobbying practices, a revolving door between Harverscorp and government agencies. It was enough to raise his suspicions, to make him wonder if BloomRite had been just a testing ground for something far more ambitious. One grey afternoon, a package arrived at his office. It was small, unassuming, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. Inside, nestled amongst packing peanuts, was a single potato. It wasn't a perfect, store-bought potato. It was misshapen, gnarled, and covered in patches of dark, purplish lesions. The same lesions he'd seen on Olson's potato plants during the BloomRite investigation. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The texture was strange, almost slimy. The sickly sweet odor that had permeated Olson's field filled his nostrils. He called over Sarah Jenkins, who was working as a consultant for the department on a grant-funded project. She was the only person he genuinely trusted. "Take a look at this, Sarah," he said, handing her the potato. "Does this look familiar?" Sarah examined the potato carefully, her brow furrowing in concern. She pulled out a magnifying glass and scrutinized the lesions. "This is bad," she said, her voice hushed. "Really bad." She took a small sample of the potato and placed it under a microscope. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "Daniel," she said, looking up at him, her voice trembling. "This isn't just a blight. This is a new strain, something I've never seen before. The cellular structure is altered, genetically modified, but not in a way that is consistent with standard agricultural practices." "What do you mean?" Caleb asked, his heart pounding. "It is like someone deliberately engineered this disease, designed it to attack specific types of potatoes, and it is far more aggressive, far more virulent than anything I've encountered. She paused, taking a deep breath. This isn't a natural occurrence, Daniel. Someone created this. Caleb stared at the blighted potato, a wave of dread washing over him. The past wasn't buried. It was erupting once again, threatening to engulf him in a new wave of conspiracy and corruption. The message, Harvest Corp, the engineered disease. It all clicked into place, forming a terrifying pattern. BloomRite hadn't been the end. It had been a prelude, and now something far more dangerous was unfolding. He knew, with chilling certainty, that he was about to be pulled back into the darkness, whether he wanted to or not. He'd sought peace, but peace, it seemed, was a luxury he could no longer afford.